Hey, it's Android AT here, and I still want to talk about the Eminence and Shadow anime. To be honest, I had a lot of fun talking about the first three episodes, and I kind of want to keep going. I'm fighting the urge to talk about the season 2 ending because they did some unique things, but it's not that bad, honestly. It kind of calls back to the very first episode of the anime, and I can at least appreciate that. Well, I'm only saying that because I know that the movie's gonna cover the book 4 properly, probably. They can't mess up Beta's part, right? Anyways, so there's just this one little detail that I kind of glossed over in the first video, and I'm just going to talk about that really quick. Right before episode 3 ends, you see Sid going to school with his two friends. What they talk about doesn't really matter, they ask for forgiveness, and they kind of want more details on the relationship status. In both the anime and the manga, he kind of brushes them aside and kind of answers half-heartedly. But then he gets confronted by those magical knights, and his friends instantly sell him out. Just note that there were absolutely no resistance, they didn't get tortured, and they instantly sold out their friend. Typical mob behavior. Now, the way that Sid responds to the magical knights stating that Alexa was kidnapped is different in the anime and manga. In the light novel and manga, he's kinda happy that Alexa got kidnapped. The reason for that, he was pretty much treated like a dog instead of a boyfriend. So there is a part of him that is really happy that that girl got exactly what she deserved. The thing is while he's acting like the fake boyfriend, he fails to notice that he's being set up and is promptly captured. It plays out a little differently in the anime though. When Sid hears that Alexa has disappeared, he does not say a single word. He just listens to Zenon and slowly notices that he is being set up. He notices that there are a lot of magical knights and they are all armed. He then puts his hands behind his head, giving up because he knows that he is screwed. The one factor that pretty much changed how the anime played out is the way that Alexa treated him. Because he was not distracted by the karma that Alexa got, he actually gets to calmly assess the situation, showing the level of thought a Shadow Eminence should have. So instead of comic relief in the books, you get a little bit more of a badass scene, and I can really appreciate that. Now, I can finally talk about episode 4, and there is a little thing I want to bring up. So, for the next part, the anime, the manga, and the light novel start at different points. The anime shows us when Alexa first wakes up after being kidnapped. The manga starts when Iris and Zenon are talking about how suspicious Sid is. And the book just says screw it, it's 5 days later and Sid is done being interrogated. All I'm saying is the anime is giving you bonus content. Okay, now let's talk about Alexa waking up. She kind of handles the situation really well. She wakes up chained to a bed in an unknown place and is startled like anyone else. She even lets out a little surprised gasp when she sees, for lack of a better word, a monster. But the second she hears someone coming, she instantly switches on this indifferent personality. And that's probably for the best because the person who walks in is a literal mad scientist. So to get over the situation as soon as possible, she just lets him draw her blood while actually gaining answers about her situation, which just fleshes her character out some more. Then the anime switches to Sid's torture POV. He is practically naked in an interrogation room and they're trying to force a confession. They are literally torturing him, and the bit he's going for is the mob who doesn't want to die who's whining the entire time. He even calls this classic minor character material. And that would be the case if you didn't really think about it really hard. Do you remember his two mob friends that instantly gave him up without even a hint of torture? Just the idea of intimidation made them squeal instantly. Now get back to Sid and he's literally being stabbed and beat up. And all he's doing is denying it and crying. And if that was it, maybe it's a mob situation. But in the book, it clearly states that he gets tortured for 5 whole days. So, yeah. That is something the main character in a story would do, because even 5 minutes of torture is too much for some. Moving on really quick, we get back to Alexa, and I just guessing that this is day 4 of her kidnapping. The reason for that is that she has 3 syringe wounds and the scientist is going for 4. Alexa still shows no reaction to whatever the scientist is doing, even goes along with it. And we see a glimpse of what would happen if she didn't really go along with it, because you can see how he treats his subjects. That scene ends with showing how deranged that scientist is by force feeding her. Now, this is where the manga starts. The only difference from the anime to the manga is that Claire doesn't even make it to the room. She's being actively held back, and Rose Oriana makes a guest appearance and stops her. If she does get to confront Iris, we get to find out this is where Sid has been kidnapped for 5 days. Now we finally get to where the light novel started, when Sid gets kicked out of the interrogation room in just his underwear. He then has to get dressed and then heads home. An interesting little tidbit from the light novel is that it took a while for him to get dressed because the torturers kind of pulled off his fingernails. Kind of reinforces the fact that he might not be quite mob-like, surviving 5 days of torture while not giving the interrogators anything. There is one thing that's consistent though: he refuses to heal himself because a mob should stay injured. And while he is commuting home, he finds out he is being followed. The anime does a really good job of showing, not telling. There is very little dialogue, and you know exactly what's happening. Just from Alpha saying later, she probably handled it herself. Well, on the topic of showing, not telling, this anime really likes to show. It kinda knows its audience and figured out how to maximize its material. In the books, she is wearing the standard Shadow Garden bodysuit. All she's there to do is to kind of give a report to Sid, and the attire fits the situation. All that's supposed to happen is a cute little back and forth between Sid and Alpha. So the people making the anime must have thought, hey, it doesn't matter what she's wearing, right? So put her in a school uniform. And since they're just talking, it doesn't matter what Alpha's doing, so fan service. It's kind of really funny that it is so blatant and Sid doesn't react at all. He just goes along with it. This is not a one-off, by the way. The anime kind of knows its audience, so whatever extra things they're doing, it's not in the source, but at least it's for the fans, right? Moving on. So it turns out that the sister actually does make it to Iris, but that's just happening in the background because we find out where Alexa's being held, and it is somewhere really close to the school. And she's not okay anymore. She's kind of lost the light in her eyes. This is just a little bonus scene that the anime included just because they kind of really like Alexa. But enough of that. I want to talk about Sid's antics, which is pretty much one of the best parts about this story. To set the scene, quite literally, he knows that Beta is going to visit him soon. So he decides to completely redecorate his dorm room. He starts pulling out the most expensive things he's owned, but you have to remember, he grinded for all of that. And going through all that effort fills him with a sense of joy because you finally get to see the fruits of his labor. He puts the final touch, the envelope under that wine glass, and then he just waits there. Beta comes into the room, opens the door, a gust of wind happens, and then Sid says the time has come. I have to admit it is a pretty cool scene. Just look at the manga panel, it is picturesque. His back is towards Beta, he has a glass of wine in his hand, there is the soft lighting of the moonlight, and Beta just so happens to come into the room when he's finished monologuing. This is a really cool scene, but when I started watching the anime, it got really funny to me. The book doesn't say it, but in the manga, he starts redecorating in the middle of the night. But in the anime, we clearly see it is sunset and then it becomes night. So you can just assume once he was done redecorating, he was just sitting there waiting the entire time. We saw him setting up. So when Beta finally gets in the room, we notice that there's some extra things in the room. There's a deer head, and then there's a whole chandelier. And sure, those things can fit in the room, but the weird thing is that there's some weird bird statues that are kind of just standing there. We see him go through the effort of hand-picking his decoration, polishing his chair even, and they're just these birds. They are never mentioned. I don't think the characters even care that they're there. And they kind of just stick out every time they're on screen. It just made me laugh, because he must have put it there on purpose. Other than that, the content of the same pretty much stays the same in the manga and the anime, but it plays out slightly different in both. Let me just quickly talk about the manga and then the anime. So during this entire time, he was just wearing his school uniform, and this is the panel that this scene ends on. The entire time, he is sitting in that chair, and he just holds that glass of wine, never drinking it. And at the very end, he looks into the distance, gripping that wine glass, and he just says that this prelude is mine to perform. If you look at all the panels, you'd see that he never turns his head, and the content of the wine never changes when you know how expensive that wine is. I just found that funny, and I didn't notice it the first time. In the anime, it is very similar. The differences are that he is wearing his slime suit, he actually drinks the wine, and the only time he looks at Beta is at the very ending. He gets up from the chair, tells Beta that the world will finally know who they are, and a sudden breeze hits him. Just note that that door was open the entire time, and just when he got up and said that one-liner, he gets a sudden gust of wind. And Beta's just there, just open mouth, basking in his glory. You know what the anime doesn't explain? What's on that letter? It is a ransom note, so the magical knights are trying to set him up. And he obviously knows it's a trap, but he just goes along with it. But in the anime, it just shows you, it doesn't matter what's on that letter. They couldn't even frame him because their members were already dead. I do have to show you one thing that's kind of consistent in both. Well, Shadow is already handling all these enemies. Beta's in the background just kind of writing down his greatness. And the best part is the manga shows her art skills, and it is just shoujo. The last thing in episode 4 that I will talk about is when Alexa finally escapes. In the anime, Zenon just gives up the fact that he owns everything and this is his master plot. But in the books, Alexa uses deduction to kind of trick him into giving it up, which is kind of sad that the anime kind of skips. It reinforces that idea that Alexa showed that perfect people are always hiding something. And the manga paints Zenon in this very positive light, making Alexa seem like she's throwing a hissy fit. When Alexa finally escapes and Zenon just so happens to be there, he continues to act like this perfect person, but when Alexa confronts him and how convenient this all is, he finally goes mask off. You always knew he was sus, and when it's finally confirmed, you're like, yeah, he's about to get what he deserves. And it really doesn't matter because who cares about Zenon? But the anime skipped it, and that's kind of a shame. So Alexa starts fighting Zenon, and she's getting her ass handed to her. In the manga, she at least puts up a fight, but in the anime, no. She is completely outclassed, but when all hope seems lost, Shadow makes his appearance, which ends the episode. Now, episode 5 starts with Shadow and Zenon talking, and just when they're about to fight, we cut to the monster subplot. Now, there isn't much that changes, except for the very ending of the fight. When Alpha gives the final strike, which kills the monster turns back into the little girl, and a locket drops. We see a picture of the girl and her dad, and if he looks familiar, it's because he's the person who kidnapped Claire before they got to school. He might have been a 2-bit villain, but when he finally dies, we see him drop a locket with the same exact picture, and the last words before he died was Milia. That is how the anime pulls it off, and I like it better this way. In the books, he just dies thinking about his daughter, and when the daughter is finally killed, she drops a dagger that says, "To my beloved Milia." In the book, that is how they confirmed that the daughter was the monster, but having matching lockets just hits so much harder. Now to get back to Zenon and Shadow fighting. I have to say this first, I really like how they chose to animate how Shadow fights in this scene. To kind of get a picture of what I'm saying, just look at how the anime portrays it. Shadow makes Zenon not even look like a threat. It looks so one-sided that it doesn't even look like Zenon has the potential to win. But in the anime, Shadow gives Zenon the chance to fight back. Shadow is just reacting to whatever Zenon is doing, and it really lets you see what mediocre swordsplay looks like. When I was reading the books, I didn't understand what mediocre swordsplay was, but the anime really does capture that. There is nothing flashy about the way that Shadow moves, but Zenon looks like he's fighting a brick wall. And that is because Shadow has completely mastered the basics. If you pay attention to the way that Shadow does things, it is nothing that complicated. It is just the basics to the extreme. It just makes you appreciate what Shadow does a lot more. He puts in so much effort. Just think back to when he completely redecorated that room to set the scene for hearing Beta's report when she would be amazed at anything he did. He didn't need to put in any effort, but he did. Which kind of makes the moment a lot more cooler, you know? Which brings us back to Alexa watching Shadow, and she finally understands what her sister meant by saying, "I like your swordsmanship." It was never meant to mock her, it was to show appreciation for the effort she put into the craft. And when Alexa sees a bit of herself in the way that Shadow fights, and then Shadow just does the simplest slash to cut down Zenon, it's just awesome. That was a bit of a tangent for the simplest of points, but whatever. There was no way I wasn't going to talk about this. The way that Shadow handles Zenon after he starts taking pills. In the books, it quickly escalates to you know what, but in the anime, it drags it out. That is a very classic thing animes like to do, and in most cases, it doesn't work, but for this one, it does. So, Shadow just watches Zenon power up. He doesn't say a single thing, he's just watching Zenon brag about how much stronger he got after taking those pills. It wasn't until Zenon did that thrust that Shadow finally said something, and it was unsightly. In the books, in response to Zenon transforming, both Alexa and Shadow say something like, "how ugly" or "how unsightly." Alexa is probably referring to the way that Zenon looks, but Shadow is not. They just decide to completely cut out Alexa's line because they really want you to focus on what Shadow is saying. And pay attention to when he said that. He didn't say anything until Zenon made that attack. Zenon just kept on bragging about how much stronger he became after taking those pills, but the result of it wasn't really anything special. So, to kind of prove a point, after he deflects that initial thrust, he just beats him up without using his sword. Zenon is getting absolutely obliterated at this point, and Shadow decides to just start giving off a speech. There is no shortcut to becoming strong, and then he destroys that pill bottle. He starts channeling his magical power, the room turns purple, and he says playtime is over. He completely ignores Zenon at this point and just goes over his personal story about how he struggled against overcoming a nuke. He took no shortcuts and came to the conclusion that he must become the nuke himself. Then Shadow just looks down on Zenon like he is an insect. That kind of triggers Zenon, so he attacks once more with his sword, but Shadow doesn't move a muscle because that sword destroys itself. That is the moment that Zenon finally notices that he is powerless in front of the Almighty. Which finally builds up to the climax of the scene where he goes atomic. Just the way that scene builds up is just so much more impactful than how the books do it. In the manga, Zenon's just confused of what's happening and doesn't get it even after he dies. And in the light novel, it's like the anime but to the point. There is no backstory, but Shadow still goes through the motions. He tells them that Zenon cannot be strong on borrowed power and proceeds to show him what is true power. He starts unleashing his magic and Zenon is starting to panic, and Shadow says this one line that isn't in the anime. When he prepares to strike, he says, "This is me at my peak." That is what he says while he's preparing his stance. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. There are so many little embellishments that kind of enhance the moment. They didn't start the scene off with a joke. In the manga and book, they start off with how ugly Zenon became after taking those pills. And just the way that Shadow acted, he stomps on that bottle, reinforcing that uncompromising no shortcuts to strength mentality. And then he proceeds to beat Zenon with his fist because he wasn't even worth his sword. The fact that Shadow could just casually go through his entire backstory within a fight just shows that he was not a threat at all. And just the way the voice actor emphasizes that atomic at the very end just completes the scene. It is these little extra details that weren't in the books that just show that the people who made this anime care. Now there is a bit more to this episode, so let's talk about that crater. Once the light fades, it is just silence in the anime. It just lets the audience simmer on what just happened. In the dead of night, a massive beam of light kind of disintegrated a hole in the middle of a city. And the crazy thing is that nobody reacts. There is no light, there is no sound, it is just dead silence. Eventually the camera focuses on Alexa and she is just staring at the sky now that there is a hole in the city. The anime just lets you kind of bask in the destruction that Shadow caused, unlike the books. From what I remember, the light novel never really brings up the hole in the city. And the manga shows you the destruction, but then it never really appears again in the story. But then you have the anime, and it does show the hole again, acknowledging that the destruction has happened, but no one really acknowledges it, which is a cool, fun little detail. And the way that Alexa handles this situation afterwards is a bit different. In the book, she's kind of spaced out until she hears her sister, but in the anime, she actually picks up the sword and attempts to mimic what Shadow just did. Now, for this scene, this is when Alexa kind of confesses to Sid. Remember, the only reason they were together in the first place was for her to avoid marrying Zenon. Now that he's been vaporized, they don't have a reason to be together, so that brings us to this scene. But first, let me talk about the manga because it plays slightly different. The scene starts off with Alexa telling Sid that he is no longer suspected. Remember, Sid got falsely accused for kidnapping Alexa, got tortured for days, and now she's telling him that you should be glad that this is all that happened. Sid pretty much sums it up perfectly. She's still the same old arrogant person from before. She can't even thank him right. She starts off strong. She brings up that one time he said he liked her swordsmanship. She brought that up so that she can bring up that she now likes her swordsmanship. No thanks to him. Even the way she talks about Zenon dying fits her character because he deserved it for kidnapping her. Now for the climax of the scene. Alexa knows that they have no reason to pretend to be together now, so she's gonna try to make it real. She becomes as cute as possible. Just remember how we got introduced to the character. The only difference is that the blush is just a touch bit darker. She then asks Sid directly if they could continue this, but gets interrupted. You think back to all the experiences they had together, and turns out none of them were good. So the obvious answer from Sid is no. He would rather die than spend another second with her. And for good reason, he was treated like a dog. It looks like Alexa doesn't like that answer because she's visibly upset and she pulled out her sword. It turns out this was a historic day for the school because a new legend was born that day. But now to talk about the anime. It starts off with Alexa not even looking at Sid. She calls out to Sid to give him an update, and once that's done, he attempts to leave immediately. That is when Alexa turns around and stops him. She then proceeds to thank Sid, but just the way the anime presents it gives it a completely different vibe. From the looks of it, she appears to be nervous. She's fidgeting with her hair, she's blushing, and we don't see her eyes. She is thanking Sid just like in the manga, but it feels different. Maybe it's because it's animated, but it feels more genuine, and when she takes it back, it feels playful. And this entire time, Sid is treating her exactly the same as always, passively. Now, he tries to leave once more, but is stopped by Alexa, and this time, Alexa confesses. And just like in the manga, she is coldly rejected. But the way she handles it is just a little bit more scary. You see, once she hears Sid's answer, she's initially shocked, but then it seems like she handled it with grace. She starts smiling, she bobs her head, goes, heh. But then when you look at her eyes, they're not smiling. And in the next second, without warning, blood splatters against a wall, and you can probably guess whose blood that is. It was probably the shame and embarrassment that got her, because she really did want to get along with him. You know how I know that? Because in the light novel, Alexa asks Iris if there is an apology that guarantees forgiveness. Which makes Iris think that Alexa has finally made a friend. This conversation is a part of a bigger scene, and I'll get there when we hit episode 10, but it just reminded me that I completely blanked out and I thought that scene was anime only. Anyways, back on topic. So the remainder of the episode is pretty much filler. There are bits and pieces of foreshadowing, but for the most part, it's just there to pad out time. Now, it's just the final scene that I'm going to talk about because I find it funny. So we see the next girl, Sherry, and she's going to be very relevant because she is researching the artifact. Her hands are kind of full and she's not entirely paying attention to where she's going. When she bumps into a student, she drops everything and falls to the floor. The mysterious student with a convenient shadow covering his face lends out a helping hand. We find out that that student is Sid, still covered in his own blood, which means he just escaped from Alexa. The part that I find funny is that it's seen straight out of a rom-com like Peers, but Sid is still covered in blood. Which means he was just casually walking around the school covered in blood and nobody questioned it. So maybe he is truly a mob. And that pretty much wraps up everything I gotta say about episodes 4 and 5. I swear, I will eventually finish season 1. I don't know when. It's going to happen. Probably. Anyways, if you made it this far, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. If you like the content, please like, comment, and subscribe. Peace. Hey, this is Android slightly in the future, so I have just finished editing this and I just came to the conclusion that I have to work on this while I'm working on other videos or I'll never get anything done. So if you're waiting for more of this, you might not want to hold your breath. Alright, peace. Bye.